What would drive a brother to kill his own sister? What secret was so dangerous that it destroyed an entire family and shocked a conservative American town to its core? This is the story of Prudence and Fletcher Garrison, siblings whose forbidden relationship led to a tragedy that the small town of Millbrook, Ohio, still whispers about 40 years later. It's a case that exposes the dark side of family secrets, small-town pressure, and what happens when love crosses the most fundamental boundaries of society. Before we begin, I want you to think about this. How well do you really know the people closest to you? What secrets might they be hiding behind closed doors? Because in 1985, the Garrison family seemed like the perfect American household, until one November morning, when police found 22-year-old Prudence dead in an abandoned warehouse, and her 20-year-old brother Fletcher standing over her body in shock. This story is based on real court documents, police reports, and interviews with residents who lived through this tragedy. Nothing has been dramatized or embellished. What you're about to hear actually happened in a town not unlike yours, to a family that could have been your neighbors. Real quick, stats show that about 95% of viewers watching our videos aren't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying this story, take a second to subscribe. It helps the channel grow and brings more stories like this to you and others who need them. Let's keep going. Let me take you back to Millbrook, Ohio in 1985, a time when America was experiencing an economic boom. But small towns like this one still operated under strict moral codes that hadn't changed much since the 1950s. Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did. Population 12,000, nestled in the farmland of central Ohio. It was a community built around three pillars: family, faith, and hard work. The town had neat suburban streets lined with modest homes, a main drag with local businesses that had been family-owned for generations, and the Millbrook Baptist Church, where attendance on Sunday wasn't just expected, it was mandatory for anyone who wanted to maintain their standing in the community. The Garrison family lived on Elm Street in a two-story colonial with white shutters and a picket fence that looked like it came straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Bartholomew Garrison, age 45, owned and operated Garrison Auto Repair, a business his father had started in 1952. His wife, Cordelia, worked as a bookkeeper for the local grain elevator. They were pillars of their community, regular churchgoers, active in town events, and parents to two children who seemed destined for success. Prudence, their daughter, was 22 years old in 1985. She just graduated from Ohio State University with a degree in elementary education and had moved back home while searching for a teaching position. Neighbors described her as intelligent, ambitious, and beautiful, tall with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to light up when she laughed. She was the kind of young woman that mothers pointed to as an example for their own daughters. Fletcher, 2 years younger, was studying mechanical engineering at the local community college while working part-time at his father's shop. He was athletic, popular, and according to his high school yearbook, voted most likely to take over the family business. Friends described him as outgoing and confident, the kind of guy who could fix your car and charm your grandmother in the same afternoon. From the outside, the Garrisons had everything a 1980s American family was supposed to want. But as we'll discover, beneath that perfect facade, something was growing that would ultimately destroy them all. Prudence and Fletcher had always been close. As children, they were inseparable, building forts in the backyard, riding their bikes through the neighborhood, spending entire summer days at the local swimming hole. Their parents encouraged this bond, believing that strong sibling relationships were the foundation of family values. When Prudence left for college in 1981, Fletcher was devastated. He wrote her letters every week, called whenever he could afford the long-distance charges, and counted down the days until her visits home. Their mother, Cordelia, often commented to neighbors about how sweet it was that her children maintained such a strong connection despite the distance. But when Prudence returned home permanently in June 1985, something had changed between them. Or perhaps something that had always been there finally had the opportunity to surface. Have you ever felt a connection to someone that you knew was wrong but couldn't resist? That's the question I want you to keep in mind as we explore what happened next, because what started as sibling affection was about to cross a line that would set in motion a chain of events leading to tragedy. At first, the changes were subtle. Prudence and Fletcher began spending more time together than was typical for siblings their age. They would disappear for hours, claiming to be job hunting or running errands, but neighbors started noticing them walking together through town, sitting closer than necessary on the porch swing, or standing in the driveway talking in hushed tones. Mrs. Beatrice Tompkins, who lived across the street, later told police that she'd observed them holding hands longer than normal when saying goodbye and exchanging looks that seemed too intimate for brother and sister. But in the summer of 1985, these observations were just small-town gossip, the kind of talk that spreads at church socials and over backyard fences. Prudence began keeping a journal that summer, writing in it every night before bed. In entries that would later become crucial evidence, she documented feelings she couldn't share with anyone else. She wrote about the confusion of loving someone she knew she shouldn't, about the guilt that kept her awake at night, and about the fear of what others would think if they knew the truth. Fletcher, meanwhile, became increasingly withdrawn from his friends. He stopped going to the usual hangout spots, declined invitations to parties, and spent most of his free time at home. When questioned by buddies about his behavior, he claimed he was focused on his studies and helping his father expand the auto shop. The social context of 1985 America is crucial to understanding their situation. This was the height of the Reagan era, when traditional family values were being celebrated and promoted through every channel of media and government. In conservative communities like Millbrook, any deviation from accepted norms wasn't just frowned upon, it was considered a threat to the moral fabric of society. The local Baptist church, where the Garrisons attended services twice weekly, regularly delivered sermons about the sanctity of family relationships and the importance of maintaining proper boundaries. Pastor Cornelius Whitmore often spoke about how Satan worked to corrupt families from within and how vigilance was required to protect against moral decay. For Prudence and Fletcher, growing up in this environment while harboring feelings they knew were forbidden created an almost unbearable internal tension. They were trapped between their desires and everything they'd been taught about right and wrong. By late summer, their relationship had evolved beyond emotional intimacy. They began meeting in secret late-night walks through the deserted downtown area, conversations in Fletcher's car parked in isolated spots outside town, and stolen moments when their parents were at work. They developed a system of coded communication to arrange these meetings. If Prudence mentioned needing to return a library book, it meant she wanted to meet at the old oak tree behind the Methodist church. If Fletcher said he was checking on something at the shop, it meant he'd be waiting in his car at the abandoned grain silo on County Road 15. These clandestine encounters became the highlight of their days, but they also intensified their feelings of guilt and fear. Prudence's journal entries from this period reveal a young woman tormented by conflicting emotions, desperate to be with Fletcher, but terrified of the consequences if they were discovered. What do you think was going through their minds during these secret meetings? Can you imagine the weight of carrying such a forbidden secret in a town where everyone knows your business? Share your thoughts in the comments, because understanding their psychological state is crucial to comprehending what happened next. As autumn approached, the pressure of maintaining their secret began to take its toll. Prudence became irritable and moody, snapping at her mother over minor household issues and spending long periods alone in her room. Cordelia attributed this to job-hunting stress and the difficulty of adjusting to post-college life. Fletcher's grades at the community college began to slip, and his performance at the auto shop became erratic. Bartholomew noticed his son's distraction, but assumed it was typical young adult restlessness, perhaps anxiety about his future, or romantic troubles with local girls. The truth was far more complicated. Prudence and Fletcher were falling deeper into a relationship they knew was destructive but felt powerless to stop. Their secret meetings became more frequent and more risky. They began using an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a relic from Millbrook's more industrial past that had been empty for over a decade. Meanwhile, the community around them continued its normal rhythms. Friday night football games at the high school, Sunday services at various churches, harvest festivals, and the approaching Christmas season. Life in Millbrook proceeded as it always had, while the Garrison family unknowingly sat on a powder keg that was about to explode. In October 1985, their carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Cordelia found a note in Prudence's room that simply said, "Meet me by the old mill at 10 p.m., in handwriting she didn't recognize. When she asked Prudence about it, her daughter claimed it was from a college friend who was visiting town. But Cordelia's maternal instincts told her something wasn't right. Around the same time, Bartholomew noticed that Fletcher had been taking the family car at odd hours, claiming he needed to pick up parts for the shop or meet study groups for school. When Bartholomew checked with Fletcher's professors and the part suppliers, these stories didn't add up. The parents began comparing notes, and a disturbing picture emerged. Both of their children were lying about their whereabouts, both were acting strangely, and both seemed to be hiding something significant. But what parent wants to believe the worst about their children? Bartholomew and Cordelia convinced themselves that Prudence and Fletcher were probably involved in typical young adult activities. Maybe Prudence was secretly dating someone the family wouldn't approve of, or Fletcher was experimenting with drinking or other mild rebellions. They had no idea they were sitting on a secret that would destroy their family and shock their community to its core. The breaking point came on November 10th, 1985. Cordelia, unable to shake her growing suspicions, decided to search Prudence's room more thoroughly while her daughter was out. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, she discovered Prudence's journal. What she read there changed everything. The journal contained detailed accounts of Prudence's relationship with Fletcher, their secret meetings, their growing physical and emotional intimacy, and most damaging of all, explicit descriptions of encounters that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Cordelia was devastated. She'd raised her children in a Christian home, taught them right from wrong, and believed she'd instilled proper moral values. Reading her daughter's words was like discovering that everything she thought she knew about her family was a lie. When Bartholomew came home from work that evening, Cordelia confronted him with the journal. His reaction was immediate and explosive. The man who prided himself on running a respectable household, who served as a deacon at their church, who had built his reputation on being a pillar of the community, felt his world collapsing. That night, they confronted Prudence. The conversation was explosive, filled with accusations, denials, tears, and ultimately a confession that confirmed their worst fears. Prudence broke down and admitted that she and Fletcher had crossed lines that should never be crossed, but she begged her parents to understand that neither of them had intended for it to happen. When Fletcher returned home later that evening, he found his parents waiting for him with expressions of fury and betrayal. The confrontation that followed was even more intense than the one with Prudence. Bartholomew, feeling his family's reputation and his own standing in the community threatened, ordered Fletcher to end all contact with his sister immediately. But it was too late. The damage was done, and the wheels were already in motion for a tragedy that would destroy them all. What followed was 5 days of the most intense family crisis the Garrisons had ever experienced. Prudence and Fletcher were forbidden from being alone together, but the enforced separation only intensified their desperation. They began planning to leave Millbrook together, to start over somewhere else where no one knew their history. Prudence wrote a note to Fletcher suggesting they run away together, but Bartholomew intercepted it when he searched Fletcher's room. The discovery of this note sent their father into a rage, unlike anything his children had ever seen. He threatened to have Fletcher arrested, to disown both children, and to expose their secret to the entire community if they didn't end their relationship immediately. The pressure became unbearable. Prudence felt trapped between her love for Fletcher and her terror of losing her family forever. Fletcher, caught between his feelings for his sister and his father's threats, began to crack under the strain. On the evening of November 14th, 1985, both siblings separately decided they couldn't take the pressure anymore. They arranged to meet at the abandoned warehouse one last time to decide what to do. Neither of them told their parents where they were going. What happened in that warehouse would remain a mystery that haunted Millbrook for decades to come. The next morning, November 15th, 1985, a local farmer named Ezekiel Brennan was driving past the old Whitmore manufacturing warehouse when he noticed the door was ajar. The building had been abandoned for years, and vandalism was a constant problem, so he decided to investigate. What he found inside would traumatize him for the rest of his life. Prudence Garrison lay motionless on the concrete floor, her auburn hair spread around her head like a dark halo. Her brother Fletcher sat nearby, staring at her body with vacant eyes, seemingly unaware of Brennan's presence. Brennan immediately called the police from his truck radio. Within minutes, the warehouse was swarming with officers, paramedics, and investigators. Prudence was pronounced dead at the scene. Fletcher was taken into custody, though he seemed to be in a state of shock and was unable to provide any coherent explanation of what had happened. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire. In a town where the most serious crime was usually teenage vandalism or the occasional drunk driving incident, a death involving two young people from a respected family was unprecedented. Bartholomew and Cordelia received the call at 8:30 that morning. By 9 a.m., they were at the police station, struggling to comprehend that their daughter was dead and their son was in custody as the primary suspect. The investigation that followed revealed the tragic culmination of weeks of family pressure and emotional turmoil. According to Fletcher's eventual statement to police, he and Prudence had met at the warehouse to discuss their options. Prudence was insistent that they should leave town together immediately, that night, and start a new life somewhere else. Fletcher, however, had begun to realize the impossibility of their situation. He understood that running away would only make things worse, that they could never truly escape the reality of what they were to each other. He tried to convince Prudence that they needed to end their relationship and find a way to rebuild their lives separately. What happened next remains disputed. Fletcher claimed that Prudence became hysterical when he suggested they separate permanently. According to his account, she threatened to harm herself if he abandoned her, and when he tried to restrain her, they struggled. In the chaos of that struggle, Prudence struck her head against a concrete pillar. The medical examiner's report supported Fletcher's version of events to some degree. Prudence had died from blunt force trauma to the skull, but the injury pattern was consistent with an accidental impact rather than an intentional blow. However, the physical evidence couldn't determine whether Fletcher had pushed her during their struggle or if she had fallen on her own. Fletcher was charged with involuntary manslaughter, and the case became the most sensational trial in Millbrook's history. The prosecution argued that Fletcher had killed his sister in a moment of rage when she threatened to expose their secret. The defense maintained that Prudence's death was a tragic accident that occurred during an emotional confrontation. But beyond the legal questions of guilt and innocence lay deeper issues that the community struggled to understand. How had two young people raised in a loving Christian home ended up in such a destructive relationship? What role had social pressure and family expectations played in driving them to that warehouse on that November night? The trial lasted 3 weeks and divided the town. Some residents believed Fletcher was a cold-blooded killer who had murdered his sister to protect himself. Others saw him as a confused young man who had made terrible choices but never intended to harm anyone. What do you think really happened in that warehouse? Was it murder, manslaughter, or a tragic accident? The jury had to make that determination based on conflicting evidence and the testimony of a young man whose life had been shattered by circumstances he never fully understood. In March 1986, Fletcher Garrison was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The verdict satisfied no one. Those who believed he was a murderer thought the sentence was too light, while those who saw him as a victim of circumstances thought any prison time was unjust. For Bartholomew and Cordelia Garrison, the verdict meant the loss of both their children. Prudence was dead, and Fletcher might as well have been. They couldn't bring themselves to visit him in prison, couldn't forgive him for what had happened, and couldn't face the judgment of their community. Within 6 months of the trial, they had sold their house, closed the auto repair shop, and moved away from Millbrook. Neighbors said they looked like they had aged 10 years in the span of one. The perfect family that had once been the pride of Elm Street had been completely destroyed. Fletcher served 3 years of his sentence before being released on parole in 1989. He never returned to Millbrook, and according to local rumors, he changed his name and disappeared into anonymity somewhere in the American West. Whether he ever found peace or redemption remains unknown. The Garrison house on Elm Street stood empty for 2 years before finally being sold to a family from out of state who knew nothing of its history. The new owners painted over the white shutters, removed the picket fence, and tried to erase the physical reminders of what had happened there. But in a town like Millbrook, some memories never fade. 40 years later, older residents still remember the Garrison family tragedy as a cautionary tale about the dangers of family secrets and the destructive power of forbidden love. The abandoned warehouse where Prudence died was demolished in 1990, but locals still refer to the empty lot as Garrison's Field, and teenagers dare each other to walk across it at night. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story is how ordinary it began. The Garrisons weren't monsters or criminals. They were a normal American family dealing with an abnormal situation. Prudence and Fletcher weren't evil people. They were young adults who found themselves trapped by feelings they couldn't control and circumstances they couldn't escape. Their tragedy raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of family, love, and moral boundaries. It forces us to confront the possibility that sometimes people we love can cross lines that destroy everything we think we know about them. In conservative communities like Millbrook in 1985, there was no place for nuanced discussions about complex family dynamics or psychological counseling for troubled relationships. There was only right and wrong, acceptable and unacceptable, moral and immoral. For young people caught between their desires and society's expectations, this rigid framework could become a trap with no escape. The story of Prudence and Fletcher Garrison serves as a reminder that family secrets, when kept in the dark, can grow into something destructive and dangerous. It shows us what can happen when young people feel they have no one to turn to, no safe space to discuss their struggles, and no path toward healing and redemption. Most importantly, it demonstrates that tragedy can strike any family, in any town, at any time. The perfect suburban life that the Garrisons projected to their community was ultimately an illusion, hiding problems that festered until they exploded into violence and loss. What lessons can we learn from this tragedy? How can families create environments where young people feel safe to discuss their struggles before they become destructive? How can communities balance moral expectations with compassion for those who are struggling? These are questions that Millbrook, Ohio grappled with in 1985 and 1986, and they remain relevant today, because beneath the specific details of this case lies a universal truth. When love goes wrong, when family bonds become destructive, and when secrets grow too heavy to bear, the consequences can be devastating for everyone involved. The Garrison family tragedy reminds us that the line between love and destruction can sometimes be terrifyingly thin, and that the cost of crossing that line can be higher than anyone imagines. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. Do you think the outcome could have been different if the family had sought professional help instead of trying to handle the situation alone? What role do you think social pressure played in driving Prudence and Fletcher to that warehouse? Share your theories in the comments below. If this story affected you the way it affected me, there are many more complex true crime cases exploring the dark side of family relationships on this channel. Subscribe if you want to continue examining the psychological and social factors that can turn ordinary families into extraordinary tragedies. Remember, the families and communities affected by these crimes are real people dealing with real pain. While we can learn from their experiences, we should never forget the human cost of the stories we tell.